There's been a noticeable shift in the way Western countries speak about Africa over the last few years. The language sounds different now. There's more talk about equal partnerships or mutual growth and shared prosperity. European leaders, especially, have tried to move away from the older donor to recipient framing because honestly, that model has become politically embarrassing over time. African governments become more vocal about it, and the citizens did too. But underneath the new language, a lot of the actual structures still operate in roughly the same way. Financial support often comes attached to long administrative processes, governance benchmarks, procurement conditions, reporting systems, auditing structures, environmental compliance reviews, migration cooperation agreements, security coordination requirements. Some of these things are reasonable on their own because transparency matters and corruption is real, mismanagement is real. But the problem is that the system surrounding these partnerships often becomes so bureaucratic that implementation starts to crawl. Infrastructure projects stall for years while paperwork moves between ministries and consultants and donor agencies and legal review boards. Meanwhile, populations are going to keep growing, energy demand keeps rising, roads still need to be built, and unemployment keeps expanding underneath all the meetings and declarations. And African leaders notice the contrast when they compare this with countries like China, Turkey, the UAE, or even Russia in some security arrangements. Those countries usually arrive with fewer lectures and fewer administrative layers. That doesn't necessarily mean that their intentions are pure, far from it. But from the perspective of governments trying to build ports, rail systems, power plants, or industrial zones quickly, speed itself becomes politically attractive, especially when citizens are demanding visible results rather than another summit document full of promises scheduled for implementations 5 years later. You can see this tension very clearly in the debt and energy situation across parts of Southern Africa around 2025 and even this year. Zambia is one example people keep discussing because the IMF restructuring programs came with strict conditions attached. Fuel subsidies had to be reduced, electricity reforms had to be introduced, and taxes expanded. The IMF's logic was not necessarily irrational. The institution wanted fiscal stability, debt stability, sustainability, and investor confidence, right? That's how these systems are designed to think. But on the ground, ordinary people experienced rising costs almost immediately, while the promised long term stability felt distant and abstract. Then the regional droughts hit. Hydropower output weakened, agricultural production suffered. Suddenly, governments were managing energy shortages and food pressure at the same time they were trying to satisfy external financial benchmarks. And this is where the frustration toward Western engagement often grows. African states are told to liberalize markets, reduce subsidies, improve governance indicators, and meet environmental standards, while many developed countries historically industrialized under very different conditions with heavy state intervention and protectionism. That contradiction does not go unnoticed anymore, particularly among younger African policymakers and economists. They look at the global system and see rules that often seem stricter once developing nations start trying to move up the value chain themselves. The issue becomes even more sensitive around mineral extraction because Africa sits on massive reserves of cobalt, lithium, manganese, copper, uranium, rare earths, all of these resources now tied directly to electrical vehicles, battery systems, AI infrastructure, and global energy transitions, right? Western governments need access to these resources, but African countries increasingly want processing, manufacturing, and long term industrial participation, not simply raw extraction deals repeated under updated branding. The bureaucracy becomes even more visible once security cooperation enters the picture. Western partnerships in Africa are often tied closely to governance reforms, democratic benchmarks, military accountability frameworks, human rights monitoring systems, regional coordination mechanisms. Again, none of these are automatically bad ideas. Some may even be necessary. But the reality is that many African states facing insurgencies, border instability, piracy, or internal conflict often need immediate operational support more than institutional seminars and procedural consultations stretching over several years. The Sahel region exposed this tension very clearly after the breakdown of French military influence in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Local governments became frustrated with what they viewed as slow moving security frameworks that produced meetings and reporting systems, and strategic reviews without fully stabilizing the situation on the ground. That frustration opened space for alternative partnerships. Russia, through military cooperation agreements and Wagner linked structures previously, moved aggressively into parts of the region because they offered something simpler politically: immediate security assistance with fewer public governance conditions attached. Of course, that model carries serious risks too. Dependency shifts rather than it disappears, right? Accountability weakens. Civilian abuses may increase, but from the perspective of governments under pressure to regain territorial control quickly, transactional agreements can seem more useful than layered Western frameworks, requiring compliance with dozens of external institutional expectations first. And once alternative partners exist, African states gain negotiation leverage. They are no longer trapped inside a single geopolitical lane. That changes the balance entirely because Western countries now have to compete for influence in ways they did not have they did not have to during earlier decades when financial institutions and development systems were tightly centralized around Washington and London and Paris and Brussels, right? There's also another issue underneath all of this involving administrative culture itself. A lot of Western engagement still assumes that governance legitimacy comes primarily through institutional process, reports, reviews, consultation periods, compliance frameworks, and audits, technical assistance missions, all of these things. The system measures success partly through procedural correctness. But many African populations judge legitimacy differently. They judge it through whether electricity works consistently, whether roads are actually getting built, whether water systems actually function, whether mining wealth improves local communities, whether jobs actually finally appear. There is a gap there sometimes between institutional performance metrics and lived public experience. And I think that Western policymakers are becoming aware of this slowly but surely, we hope. The Europeans' Global Gateway Initiative, for example, was partly designed as a response to criticism that Europe had become too slow and overly procedural compared to China's Belt and Road approach. The United States also began repositioning some African engagement more directly around strategic minerals, digital infrastructure, and energy corridors between last year and currently because global competition intensified around supply chains connected to AI systems, green energy, and semiconductor production. Africa stopped being viewed mainly as a humanitarian or development question. It became a strategic systems question: who controls the resources? Who secures the shipping routes? Who finances the ports, the railways, the power station, the data centers? Who writes the contracts governing extraction and processing? And once that shift happens, African governments started realizing that they have leverage too, enough to negotiate differently than before, enough to resist certain conditions, enough to play competing powers against each other sometimes. The old dynamic where Western institutions largely dictated the terms unchallenged is weakening, even if many bureaucratic structures from the era still remain intact underneath the surface. Mining governance sits right at the middle of this entire conversation because it exposes the gap between rhetoric and structure very, very quickly. Western governments often speak about sustainability or ethical sourcing and transparency, environmental protections, and anti corruption frameworks. Again, those concerns are real. Some African mining sectors genuinely suffered from corruption, exploitative licensing deals, environmental destruction, and revenue leakage for decades. But many African policymakers are starting to ask a more uncomfortable question now. If these minerals are suddenly essential for the future global economy, why are African countries still expected to remain mostly raw material suppliers while processing and high value manufacturing and technological ownership stay concentrated elsewhere? The reality is that global energy transition depends heavily on African resources. Electric vehicles, battery systems, renewable infrastructure, AI hardware, all of it requires minerals found across the DRC, Zambia, Namibia, South Africa, Guinea, and elsewhere in Africa. Western countries want secure access to these supply chains, partly because they are trying to reduce dependence on China's dominance in rare earth processing and battery manufacturing, right? But African governments increasingly are fighting for local refining, industrial parks, skills transfer, and domestic ownership structures included in these deals. They are trying to move beyond the older extractive pattern where wealth leaves the continent faster than value is built internally. And this is where Western bureaucratic engagement sometimes struggles. Negotiations become dense with compliance standards, reporting obligations, procurement rules, financing conditions, and climate benchmarks. Meanwhile, countries like China often arrive with infrastructure offers tied directly to the extraction agreements. It's faster, it's simpler on paper, maybe not necessarily safer long term, but I guess we will cross that bridge when we get there. But it is better to try something different than to keep doing the same thing that obviously doesn't work, right? The African states now sit between competing systems, trying to extract leverage from both while avoiding new forms of dependency disguised as partnership. What is interesting is how institutional legitimacy starts shifting once multiple global powers compete openly for influence. For a long time, Western institutions carried an assumption of automatic authority, okay? Through IMF recommendations, World Bank governance models, European Union standards. Do any of these ring a bell? These were often treated almost like default operating instructions for development itself. But multipolar competition changes that psychology. African governments now compare systems side by side in real time. One partner offers financing with governance conditions attached, another offers rapid infrastructure with fewer political demands, another offers military support tied to resource access, another one focuses on telecommunications or digital infrastructure. Not Starlink though. South Africa still rejects it, especially if Elon Musk continues to lobby against our laws and regulations. Anyway, suddenly Western institutions are not speaking into a vacuum anymore. They have competitors. And once competition enters the system, legitimacy has to be earned pretty differently, not just through historical influence or institutional prestige, but through delivery, through outcomes that people can actually see. That's partly why there's growing pressure inside Africa for leaders to negotiate more aggressively around local benefit structures. Citizens are becoming more aware of the continent's bargaining position in global systems. Social media, independent economic analysis, and regional policy networks have changed public awareness quite a bit over the last decade. Younger Africans, especially, are asking why resource rich countries still struggle with unemployment, energy instability, weak industrialization, and external debt dependence. And honestly, that has been so helpful because governments now operate under close public scrutiny than before. It becomes harder to justify agreements that visibly enrich foreign actors while domestic populations see very little structural improvement. Institutional legitimacy, whether Western or African, increasingly depends on whether systems produce tangible long term gains rather than polished diplomatic language or impressive summit declarations. And eventually, the conversation circles back to the structure of the global system itself. Military alliances, development financing, trade agreements, sanctions frameworks, energy corridors, mining contracts, digital infrastructure, all of these things connect together underneath the surface. They shape who holds leverage when crises emerge. They shape whose economies absorbs shocks more effectively. They shape which countries can negotiate from strength and which remain dependent on external approval before making major decisions. Western engagement with Africa still carries many bureaucratic habits formed during a period when global power was far more centralized, but that environment is changing now. Energy systems are shifting, supply chains are fragmenting. AI infrastructure is creating new competition around minerals, electricity, and telecommunications. Population growth is moving heavily toward Africa, while parts of Europe and East Asia age economically. And because of that, Africa's strategic relevance keeps increasing, whether global powers fully adjust to that reality or not. The countries and institutions that adapt fastest to this new balance will probably hold the most influence over time, not necessarily the ones with the loudest rhetoric or the longest institutional history. More likely, the ones capable of building systems that actually function under modern conditions without trapping their partners inside endless administrative dependency. Because in the end, influence tends to accumulate around whoever controls the infrastructure, the financing mechanisms, the security relationships, and the legal frameworks connecting all these networks together. And right now, those networks are being renegotiated in real time across Africa.